How's it going, guys? Vaibhav here from GN Tech, and welcome to a camera comparison between the Huawei P30 Pro and the Oppo Reno2. Now, they've been announced and launched for quite some time now, but these days they're very similarly priced. So I thought I might as well make a camera comparison to let you guys know how these cameras perform in varying scenarios. Right now, I'm recording this from the front-facing cameras on both of these smartphones, and this gives you an overall idea of the quality that these two cameras can record at. You can judge dynamic range, stabilization, as well as the audio that's being picked up by the microphones on these phones. So with that being said, I'm now going to move into some primary camera samples, both photos and videos, in different environments to let you guys know and give you guys an overall perspective of how both of these phones perform in different conditions. Before we get into that, here are the specifications for both phones' primary sensors. The notable difference is the 5x optical zoom on the P30 Pro with that periscope camera, but aside from that, both are quad camera units. On the front, the Reno2 has that pivot hinge style setup, and its selfie resolution count is half of that on the P30 Pro. Let's begin with this sample of a rose. I wanted to start with this to compare both phones' AI modes. In this sample, the detailing from the Reno2 is far higher than that on the P30 Pro. The P30 Pro, though, has the advantage of bringing out the subject more in this picture, which is thanks to the nice and soft background that it can produce. With AI mode enabled on both phones, its effect is far more pronounced on the P30 Pro, and while this adds vibrancy to the image, the rose suffers from a loss of detail, which isn't the case on the Reno2. In addition to the AI mode, the Reno2 does have a dazzle color option, which makes everything on screen look richer and better when combined with AI together for the overall better picture. Having tested greens and reds, I thought I'd also test blues. This is a picture with no AI enabled, and it looks like both phones are handling dynamic range well. The P30 Pro's image better nails the late evening mood with its slightly warmer look. Enabling AI, both pictures sway towards a cooler look, and I think the sharpness from the P30 Pro is a tad bit better. Dazzle color doesn't make much of a difference here, and I'd still pick the P30 Pro's image in this case. We've tested AI enough, so let's now take a look at some photos without it. This sample is interesting because the Reno2 decides to go for more vibrant colors. Now, the vibrancy looks great, but it isn't realistic to what the scene looked in real life. I'd say with a few edits, you can get both pictures to look pretty similar, so they're both doing an equally good job. I just want to point out the fact that the softer and shallower background makes the P30 Pro's image seem like it's taken with a professional DSLR. Now, let's take a look here. The Reno2, in an attempt to bring out the subject, seems to have swayed from natural colors. There's an orange hue to its background, whereas on the P30 Pro the image is more balanced. The foreground also maintains a good amount of detail without the background looking artificial. This was a great opportunity to try out the ultra wide-angle lenses on both phones. You could argue that the vibrancy and hues of the Reno2 make the picture look better, but in terms of detail, especially looking at the bridge in the foreground, the P30 Pro is better overall. Both these phones also have dedicated macro mode, so I tested them out too. While the Reno2 does an excellent job, the P30 Pro just has more detail when taking these type of pictures, and you can see that on the detail from the lock in this sample. With most of the camera capabilities now covered, let's talk about zoom. This is standard at 1x zoom, and now we'll move closer at 2x zoom. Despite not having any optical zoom, the Reno2 actually looks better detailed here if you look at the two chairs in the foreground or the building we're zooming into in the background. This is at 3x zoom, where I do see some drop in quality from the Reno2, but it's still doing impressively well against the P30 Pro. But at 5x zoom, you start seeing the effects of the P30 Pro's 5x optical zoom lens, which produces more detail on the building as well as on the pipes you see in the foreground. The difference in detail is more pronounced at 10x zoom, where the P30 Pro is easily the winner, and that stays true even at 20x zoom. Just for some fun, the P30 Pro actually has up to 50x zoom capabilities, which is pretty crazy. Taking a look at portraits, both phones are doing pretty well. Neither phone has any glaring errors when it comes to edge processing, which is great, but I like the way the Reno2 handled the background and not blowing it out like on the P30 Pro. While the Reno2 has a naturally wide view, it doesn't allow you to take close-up portraits, which the P30 Pro can do to add more flexibility to the way you take portraits. As for selfies, the higher megapixel count on the P30 Pro definitely helps its case. The Reno2 has a much cooler looking photo, which isn't bad either, but in comparison the P30 Pro's image is better. Unfortunately, neither phone does a very good job with portrait selfies, where I would have liked the phones to retain more of the background instead of simply blowing it out like in this case. With that being said, we'll now move to nighttime samples. There's a greater sharpness to the P30 Pro's images, while the Reno 2 suffers all throughout this picture. Night mode though improves the quality of both pictures by a fair bit. I'd say on the Reno 2 you find a much greater difference, and I'm impressed by how it's managed to handle the lights in the background so well. In the second picture, once again, it's clear that the P30 Pro has a massive upper hand in terms of quality. Compared to the last photo, this one's taken in an already pretty lit up environment, so it's interesting to see how night mode handles this situation. To me, the picture from the Reno 2 looks a bit washed out, whereas that on the P30 Pro, the picture has more contrast. The difference in sharpness between the phones is even more evident here, although again with night mode, the Reno 2 does a pretty good job of coming back up. Because this is the Burj Khalifa, we also thought this would be the ideal place to test the ultra wide angle camera performance, where I do think the P30 Pro still has the edge in terms of detail. With night mode, both ultra wide cameras also do pretty well. As for selfies, the more natural look comes from the P30 Pro compared to the Reno 2's fairer look. The P30 Pro does have a night mode on the front camera, which brings a considerable improvement to the picture's quality, and I want more manufacturers to start doing this. Comparing portraits, I think the Reno 2 looks better in terms of sharpness, even though its colors are not the most accurate. Moving to videos, we've got this slow motion sample, where by quality the Reno 2 looks better, but in terms of the level of slow motion, the P30 Pro has it easily. Onto 1080p video footage, the P30 Pro's is better not just in terms of stabilization, but also in terms of quality, as you can see here. When it comes to the ultra wide angle footage, the sharpness and level of stabilization comes out around the same between both the phones. Now, when I start running, neither phone does an incredible job, but I feel like the Reno 2 is somewhat better. I could say the same for the ultra-wide 1080p footage when running as well. Using super steady mode on the Reno 2 does lead to more stable footage, but it's not a drastic difference even though it's more stable than the P30 Pro in comparison. When it comes to the higher resolution 4K footage, the dynamic range and quality from the P30 Pro is better, but the stabilization from both phones remains identical. With this resolution, the P30 Pro can actually record ultra wide angle footage, which is something the Reno 2 cannot do. But when it comes to running footage at 4K resolution, I think the stabilization from the Reno 2 is far better. Nighttime 1080p video from both phones looks pretty identical if you ask me, with neither footage standing out. Using the ultra wide angle lens, again, there isn't much of a difference between both footage samples. 4K footage at night is slightly sharper from the P30 Pro, but it isn't a very evident difference if you ask me. So that's about it for this camera comparison between the Huawei P30 Pro and the Oppo Reno 2. Let us know what you think about it down in the comments below, and make sure to like and subscribe for more videos in the future. Thanks for watching, this was Vaibhav, and I'll see you in the next one. Adios.